So I just want to start by thanking AWS for inviting me to speak today. At IA, we often fall into the trope of writing very long, detailed reports, which I think no one actually ends up reading. So I'm really excited to always get out and talk about them. My plan for today is to give you an overview of our most recent publication, the Australian Infrastructure Audit, which was released last week. My plan is just to give you a quick overview of who IA is before jumping into the approach we took with the audit, the key messages, chapter by chapter findings, before concluding with next steps. And hopefully at the end there's some time for questions and comments from you guys. Oh God, I've gone. I actually went too far, I need to go back. Sorry, clearly a clip. Sorry guys. So before we deep dive into the audit, I thought it could be useful just to tell you a bit about Infrastructure Australia. So we are the nation's independent infrastructure advisor. We were established in 2008 with a mandate to provide independent advice to government, the private sector and the community on the long-term infrastructure investments and reforms required to enhance Australia's productivity, sustainability and quality of life into the future. We've also got an ABC program which we've sort of inspired called Utopia, which you might know about. As an organisation, we really live in the cycle of these 4 documents, which together present our long-term view of Australia's infrastructure. So it starts with the audit, which is our problem definition phase of identifying the challenges and opportunity facing our infrastructure over the next 15 years and beyond. Our thinking on the solutions to those challenges lives in the Australian Infrastructure Plan and the infrastructure priority lists, with policy reform solutions identified in the plan and capital infrastructure solutions which are deemed to be nationally significant living on our infrastructure priority list. Finally, we have a document called Prioritising Reform, which tracks our progress against delivering the reform solutions identified by the plan. So with the launch of the audit last week at IA, we're really at the beginning of this cycle in terms of putting forward our long-term vision for Australia's infrastructure. So turning now to the 2019 audit, which was released last Tuesday, I just wanted to start by explaining our approach to the project. So unlike a traditional audit of finances or capital assets, the 2019 audit is our assessment of service and user outcomes. And the rationale behind this focus was really based on an assessment internally of where we could add value. So our view is that documents like the Productivity Commission's Report on Government Services or BITRE's Infrastructure Yearbook really do the work in terms of counting assets and counting expenditure, but our value add could come through providing an audit of the issues facing users and their user experience of infrastructure, and particularly through the lens of access, quality and cost. So in a first for the organisation, we've extended the focus of the document beyond the 4 traditional infrastructure sectors of transport, telecommunications, energy and water. And for the first time, we're including social infrastructure, which covers health, education, green and blue space, arts and cultural facilities, justice and emergency services and social housing. We've also included waste infrastructure in our consideration of freight. So you can see how the document was 600 pages long. We've shifted away from focusing on a comparison of jurisdictions to instead consider the distinct and unique geographies at play across Australia. So the document analyses the experiences of Australians through 4 geographic categories, which together we think describes the full suite of experiences across the continent. So they are fast-growing cities, that is Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth, smaller cities and regional centres, so this is a really large category which runs from Adelaide with a population of 1.3 million to Kingaroy in Queensland with a population of 10,000. Small town, rural and remote areas, which is anywhere with a population of up to 10,000 and including some of our most remote communities. And finally, we have what we're calling developing regions or Northern Australia. And this category really picks up on some of the territory covered by the 3 categories, but in contrast speaks to the parts of Australia where they're growing but industry composition is changing and where there's a potential for infrastructure to play a catalytic role. In terms of our methodology, sort of probably reflecting a lot of what's happening in government at the moment, we've moved away from traditional approaches which are focused on sort of direct economic contributions to be instead led by theme and megatrends. And this decision was informed by our decision to use a new field of research called strategic foresighting, which looks to move away from traditional approaches which are generally sort of characterised by a kind of predict and provide mentality, to instead use sort of forecasting tools and horizon scanning to understand a sort of fullest spectrum of the potential events that might happen into the future. And our decision to adopt this methodology, unsurprisingly, was based on our assessment, and I think an assessment probably shared by many people in this room, which is that the current time we live in is really sort of defined by quite significant levels of change and uncertainty. And as a result, traditional approaches to thinking about the future are no longer sufficient in terms of dealing with those levels of change. So the final output of our work was a document totalling 640 pages, which is supported by over 2,000 pages of new research. So that includes public transport and road congestion modelling of Australia's 6 largest cities. Community research, we surveyed the perceptions of 1,500 Australians regarding their views on infrastructure, and new research on community service obligations and infrastructure affordability. And we present the findings of each of the sectors covered, and our findings take the form of 136 challenges, which are areas where we think unless action is taken, infrastructure user experiences will get worse, and 44 opportunities where action is required to capitalise on those opportunities to improve outcomes. So before jumping into the chapter-by-chapter findings, I'll just quickly take you through what we're calling our key messages from the documents. We see these as the key takeaways, and they're kind of the important things we want you to remember. There are 15 in total, so I won't go through all of them. I'll just highlight a few that I think are kind of pertinent. The first one, which is highlighted in red, is really our key message, which is our counter to the view that we're in the midst of an infrastructure boom. I'm sure you've sort of heard this terminology used before. In fact, our finding is that these sort of high levels of activity that you're seeing, particularly in our fast-growing cities, really constitute a new normal. And over the next 15 years and beyond, the pipeline of investment can be expected to be maintained and potentially increased. I think, if you think about the level of the pipeline of transport infrastructure investment in Sydney, it's quite a useful test case. So there's a pipeline of investment due to come to market, which includes the full extent of Sydney Metro, a new harbour crossing, the F6 extension, a range of new light rail investments. And if you think about that level of activity, you're looking far beyond just the immediate term. So it's our view that this mentality of a boom shifting to a mentality of a new normal needs to be implemented in the way that governments and industry and the community plan and resource and procure and contract the services required to service this sustained level of activity. I'll just quickly highlight a couple of other findings. We think that Australia has made sort of some quite important progress in terms of investment and reform, but due to the levels of change and uncertainty, that focus really needs to continue. We kind of really pull out a focus on users and call out government in particular for lacking this focus on users in terms of how they plan and benchmark their infrastructure. I think a really good example is just the sort of performance indicators that governments use to monitor the service of infrastructure. It's not particularly user focused. In terms of climate, we highlight the infrastructure sector, namely energy and transport, as one of the most significant contributors to Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, and we identify the current context of policy uncertainty as having a pretty detrimental impact. We're also quite focused on sort of this impact of place and geography on users, and we sort of call out this idea that Australia is really operating at a number of different speeds, and that's really to do with the location you're in. And our practices around planning, delivering and operating infrastructure need to change to meet those different speeds and those different locations. So, turning now to findings by chapter, I'll start with future trends. So this was our view of the mega trends which are going to fundamentally shape the delivery, operation and use of infrastructure over the next 15 years. There's 8 in total, so I'll just quickly run through them. I think in a lot of ways they won't be a big surprise to people in this room. So we found that the majority of Australians enjoy a high quality of living relative to the rest of the world, but issues of equity are increasing, and there's a growing group of people who are struggling to make ends meet. Cost of living in Australia is relatively high, reflecting high quality of life, but the real issue that came through is stagnation of wages. We're seeing a material shift in consumer preferences with trends like ethical production, product stewardship, a growing preference for on-demand services, rapidly reshaping markets and in turn infrastructure, and really challenging governments to try and keep up, which I think echoes a lot of the comments that were made on the panel before. in terms of the economy, when we started drafting the audit last year, we were kind of thinking we'd be quite bullish about saying that the economy was slowing. Unsurprisingly, there's now a growing consensus about that and a really important conversation ongoing about what role infrastructure can play in stimulating growth. We all know that the population is growing and rapidly in places like Sydney and Melbourne, but we found that participation is not. However, we are seeing growing participation from women. Again, unsurprisingly, we found technology is rapidly reshaping the world in pretty exciting ways, but it's also posing challenges in terms of access and issues like cybersecurity. And finally, the issue of climate change and the resilience of our natural and built environment really came through as a big concern for Australians. So as part of our surveying of 1,500 Australians, we had an unprompted answer about what was the biggest current concern for Australians, and unsurprisingly, climate change was the #1 response. So turning now to infrastructure for users. So these were really our cross-sectoral findings outlining all our sort of user-focused issues. So this is really where our kind of findings around access, quality and cost live. We found that technology is rapidly reshaping how Australians use infrastructure, and it's driving real clear improvements in service quality. So, I mean, you know, think Uber, think rooftop solar, think home batteries. But we found that these benefits are not being evenly shared with key sections of the community as a result of age, language, socioeconomics or geographic barriers, unable to access often the full suite of benefits that technology offers. In terms of cost for users, we commissioned some new research which used the Household Expenditure Survey to identify an average weekly infrastructure bill for Australians. And through this work, we found that the average annual household bill for infrastructure is rising, but as a proportion of income, it's actually decreasing. However, this is not true for the lowest income quintile, where we found the cost of infrastructure is hitting hard, and many of these Australians are actually experiencing income distress. As part of this work, we found that transport and telecommunications made up the biggest component of that bill, which is sort of surprising when you think about the conversation that's happening regarding energy prices. But it's important to note that this analysis was pretty imperfect, and it really spoke to the lack of data that exists around the sort of daily cost of infrastructure for Australians. So, you know, things like financing your car was included in transport costs, and the costs of your handset were included, where, you know, a stormwater tank was not. So I think they're really interesting results. They're not perfect, and we're looking to improve them. In terms of access, we found that the user experience is really determined by the geography in which you live. So in our fastest growing cities, access is high, but there is growing demand pressures from population growth. In smaller cities and regional centres, we saw that these communities are increasingly playing a regional role of supporting their surrounding areas and settlements. And in small towns and regional and remote areas, we found that infrastructure access is really not meeting a standard that most Australians expect. I think a really telling example of this is some of our findings around access to water in remote Indigenous communities. So we found that across these communities, many Australians do not have access to clean water to wash and drink. And actually, as a result of this, we as a country are failing to meet our international commitments to Sustainable Development Goal 6. Our industry capacity chapter looks specifically to the ability of the infrastructure sector to plan, deliver and operate Australia's current and future infrastructure. And as I mentioned before, we found that the elevated levels of activity are creating very real competition and capacity challenges in the contracting of services, and without action to address this is going to lead to project delay and higher costs. We also call out that a lack of coordination across the infrastructure pipeline is emerging as a clear issue. So despite the fact that there's now quite good vision about the pipeline of sort of mega projects, this hasn't delivered sort of coordination across governments about the delivery of this work. So a good example of this is, at the moment, all of Australia's largest cities have contracts out for rolling stock replenishment. And it's just really quite challenging in our market for the market to service that. And if there was, you know, beyond just having vision of the pipeline, actually coordination across it, I think would address that. So jumping into transport, we found that urban travel patterns are becoming more complex, with congestion and transport crowding increasing, and technology rapidly reshaping how we use the network. Access to transport in Australia is pretty unequal, with Australians living in the inner and middle areas of cities enjoying good access, while Australians on the outskirts of cities, in rural and remote areas, older Australians and Australians living with a disability, facing some quite serious access constraints and issues. But it's not all bad news. We really call out particularly the private vehicle market as rapidly changing with the rise of connected, autonomous and electric vehicles, as this providing a pretty exciting opportunity to reshape how Australians get around. But we also sort of note the issue of Australian governments really failing to not failing, but being quite slow relative to other parts of the world to kind of put forward coordinated action to prepare for that. Moving to freight, the audit finds that the performance of our domestic freight networks are varying. So our mineral supply chains are really world leading, but in our largest cities, poorly coordinated land use combined with the rise of micro freight is posing some pretty sort of real challenges. While in the regions we found that sort of the diverse nature of our agricultural routes and the sort of nature of seasonal flows are often quite difficult to plan for. We've also included, as I mentioned, the consideration of waste within this chapter, and we found that this is a sector in transition. So with population growth, export bans and heightened environmental awareness, creating pretty significant asset constraints and driving new service demands, but also potentially, I think, offering really a real industry for growth. As I mentioned, the 2019 audit for the first time has considered social infrastructure as part of our strategic planning process. This chapter does a lot. It actually considers 6 sectors in one, but I think it's a really important contribution. So starting with health, which covers hospitals and aged care, the audit finds that infrastructure is facing increasing constraints from rising demand and a growing and ageing population, but that technology and changing models of care provide a quite exciting opportunity to deliver step changes in service. So, for example, we were really interested to learn from some of our colleagues in WA that there's a new program which provides palliative care in the home, sort of quite a sombre topic, but it's been really, really successful. And I think part of that is a reflection of a growing preference of Australians to die at home, essentially, but also providing sort of really clear potential savings for the public health system. So I think sort of, examples like that really show kind of a potential way forward. In terms of education, we noted a trend of facilities in inner areas of cities and regional centres facing huge demand pressures, and many of these facilities not being fit for purpose in terms of delivering 21st century education services. So really running behind the kind of exciting technology leaps that are happening in education. Our work on green, blue and recreation space found that this is an infrastructure class that's hugely valued by Australians, but not well understood by sort of people like me in terms of a planning and budget process. And as a result, there's clear issues of overuse and potential under-provision in our fast-growing cities, and over-provision in low population area, which in turn creates quite a big maintenance burden for some of those local councils. Our arts and cultural infrastructure we found plays a huge role in terms of social inclusion, but again, facilities face really kind of serious funding constraints, which is compounded by the fact that the majority of the assets are ageing or often heritage listed. In terms of social housing, we found that access, quality and cost are low, with assets ageing and often sort of inappropriate for the clients who use them, and issues of crowding, particularly in terms of remote housing and long wait lists, presenting really clear challenges and also ultimately, poor services. Finally, we found with justice and emergency services, there's this kind of dynamic where they're being directly impacted by policy changes in terms of law and order, but those policy decisions are not being met by commensurate capacity increases. So, for example, in our prisons, they currently operate at 15% over capacity, and crowding, it's really kind of challenging and creating incidences of violence and limiting opportunities for rehabilitation. So I'll try and move through quickly. Moving to energy, we found that this is a sector that's undergoing really rapid transformation as a result of new energy sources and changing consumer preferences. This change is really pronounced in the electricity sector, where increased investment in renewables over the last 5 years has really rapidly reshaped the generation mix. So for example, in 2018, 1 in 5 households has rooftop solar and 21% of electricity came from renewable sources. And this figure's, we expect it to increase. So we saw in 2018 the addition of $20 billion in large-scale renewable projects. So, I think you could expect to see that number increase. But we found that this transformation is bringing real challenges because it's occurring against the backdrop of climate change and policy uncertainty about how governments will respond, particularly policy uncertainty between the different levels of government. And this is impacting consumers in terms of costs and reliability, but also industry's appetite to invest. On telecommunications, we found that this infrastructure is increasingly integral to the everyday lives of individuals and businesses. Alongside this, we're seeing substantial investment sort of now and into the future into NBN and 5G networks, but that's creating potential issues around maintenance and provision. And we also identified that despite the daily presence of our phones, access for Australians is mixed, and there are very real digital literacy issues and access issues with older Australians and regional and remote communities struggling to access services which are quite commonplace in some of our big urban centres. So my final sector is water, where we speak to a very clear distinction between urban and productive water. So in terms of urban water, we identify population growth, densification, and impacts of climate change as posing real challenges. In terms of productive water, we call out the challenges of balancing the competing needs of productive and environmental use, and we identify a lack of transparency on decision-making on key water markets like the Murray-Darling Basin as undermining community confidence and social licence to operate. Finally, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're pretty strong in terms of saying we believe sort of water quality to some of our remote Australians is really not at a standard that most Australians would expect. So before finishing, I just thought I'd give you a quick overview of what's next. As I said, with our kind of wheel of death, we're really at the beginning of our strategic planning process. So we launched the audit last week, and we're initiating a 3-month-long engagement program where we'll be seeking submissions and looking to engage directly with industry and the community on the types of solutions you see as being the best things for us to do in response to sort of all the problems I've just talked to you about. So I suppose in conclusion, my pitch really to the people in this room is to engage with us and make a submission and put forward your ideas. As I said, I think, we're a small organisation and we don't really have all the answers. So we're really hoping, particularly with this new cycle of our strategic planning, to engage really broadly, engage with the private sector to get your ideas. So, thank you very much for your time.